Welcome to Diagnosing Dx, the podcast giving diagnostics the platform it deserves. While therapeutics and devices often take centre stage, diagnostics is the engine driving precision medicine. I'm your host, David Philby, and each week we spotlight the innovators, breakthroughs, and real-world challenges shaping the future of DX. This week on Diagnosing Dx, I'm joined by Jonathan Romanowsky, a diagnostics commercialization leader who has spent more than 2 decades helping bring transformative products to market at companies like CareDx, Veracyte, and Inflammatix. We discuss why great diagnostics still fail after FDA approval, how investor expectations have fundamentally changed, why reimbursement should shape strategy from day one, and what Jonathan learned launching a sepsis diagnostic after nearly a decade of development. This is a conversation about what happens after the science works and why commercialization remains one of the hardest challenges in diagnostics. Welcome to the show this week, Jonathan. How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy to finally be on.
Well, let's get into this. So, why don't you kick us off? We've got a lot to get into. It's going to be great to hear your perspective on the market and everything that's going on. But before we do that, it'd be great to hear your background and career and what you've been doing.
Yeah, so I graduated from UC Berkeley, and frankly, when I was there, I always waffled between whether I wanted a career in medicine or business. I was interested in both. I was interested in the mission of medicine, of improving people's lives, and frankly, always admired scientists, engineers, physicians who were developing tools to make life better for patients, and that mindset. But I also liked the diversity and frankly competitive nature of business, and I always found that just very energizing, how every day is very different. I ended up starting my career in management consulting at Bain & Company, now one of obviously the bigger, broader strategic consulting firms. Then I still was waffling whether to go to medical school or business school, but ended up deciding to go to business school. At that point, I had frankly a somewhat myopic view of what a doctor would do in terms of either following patients and doing the same 5 things every day or being an academic. I didn't realize that physicians did so many other things in industry. Had I known that then, maybe I would have gone down that path, but I didn't know that. So I went to business school to Stanford, which is near where I live now. Very, very motivated on how to optimize bringing novel medical technologies to market. Being in the Bay Area where innovation is rampant, where you put a few seeds down and startups just start growing. At least that's the perception of this area. Not quite true. It's a little bit harder than that, but there are a lot of very bright people. There is an innovator's mindset, a lot of founders, a lot of talent. I more just naturally found a lot of really the most compelling opportunities that I've found tended to be with younger companies trying to really change the world, and that to me was very motivating. But I realized that a lot of these founders, whether they were scientists, engineers, and physicians who really understood their area, they really lacked understanding and tools for how to bring their products to market in an optimal way. So that was my focus at business school, and frankly, learning on the job after business school. One of the investors in a digital health company that I was working with called iScribe, which was eventually bought by one of the big pharmacies, started investing in what this new field of molecular diagnostics, and the idea of novel gene expression based tests providing unique insights that could sort of provide the right care for the right patient at the right time. They started investing in, at the time, was Genomic Health, which is now owned by Exact, and XDX, which since then has renamed itself as CareDx. I was just so compelled by the idea of sort of using someone's genome or information from one's own that could ultimately provide better care and extract a lot of value for shareholders. I was very compelled by those concepts, so I ended up joining XDX, now called CareDx, and led the launch for the AlloMap transplant rejection test in this was in 2002. Since then, I've had many posts in commercial leadership for various molecular diagnostics companies. I think chronologically, they would be after XDX, I was at CardioDx with their core CAD test. I then went to Veracyte and launched their Affirma test, which arguably is probably my most smashing successful experience. After that, I was at Telomere Diagnostics with an attempt to launch the Telomatch test, and then finally, and for the last 10 years, before leaving this fall, I was with Inflammatix and helping guide the company to launch of its Triverity test. And then these days, since leaving Inflammatix, I've put up my own shingle and have, basically bring all my years of experience to other, mostly startups, not all, but a lot of companies, mostly diagnostics, not all, helping them with strategic planning, commercialization, and fundraising strategy. Under the name of Kadima Spark is what I've called my consulting practice.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. So what you're doing now is you're really using all your experience to provide consultancy services to majority startups. And are you enjoying that work? Has that been fulfilling to come in and sort of and now be seen as an expert in the field and be able to provide that?
Um, I would say yes. It's also a little bit strange because when you're in the middle of sort of heads down focusing on your product, you may not realize all the quote unquote wisdom that you're gaining. So as you're meeting sort of folks who are experiencing for the first time, you realize like, oh wow, they really don't know what's going to be around this bend, or frankly, it's many bends, or a analogy that Tim, my co-founder of Inflammatix, and I always talked about is really like when you climb a mountain. If you're going to go climb Everest, it's not just one straight up hill. As you go up a hill, then you go down to a valley. You go up a bigger hill, down into sometimes a bigger valley, and then up another hill. And that's the reality for any startup. I think diagnostics or any field, as what it's really like. And it has been rewarding to provide that wisdom to companies. On the other hand, there's no sort of more motivating feeling than when sort of a product is quote unquote your own. So it's only been a few months since I've been in this role, and I think the jury is out whether I will stick with it like this, or if something is so compelling, and I think the opportunity is appropriate for me to dive right in. Although I will say in this environment, it's a pretty sobering environment from a fundraising standpoint, especially. So unlike previous years, I think the bar is a bit higher, at least for me to consider deciding to actually jump into something new. But I think I would consider it. But for now, I'm really enjoying engaging with several companies, and frankly, I'm also advising others and on the board of others. So my cup is full, and very very energized with everything I'm doing. And actually, in an interesting way, I haven't seen an environment with more promising technologies, but potentially with the least amount of funding available to promote them. So it's a bit frustrating because I think there could be a lot of impact, but one needs fuel to reach your destination, especially if you're trying to be transformative, and and how to square that is the big question of the day.
It's definitely frustrating, but I loved how you mentioned how energizing it is, because I feel that quite regularly whenever I work with a new early stage founder who needs help, and it's almost infectious, their energy for their product, and how excited they are, and I think I feed off that, to be honest. So it's lovely to be able to sort of get in early across a few different companies and sort of go, oh, there's some really exciting stuff here going on. That is really energizing.
I agree. I definitely have that feel of a kid in the candy store where your parents says, well, if you're going to go, you can only pick one candy, or if I was going to kind of join one of these companies or start something new, you have
Yeah.
to really dive all in into that one. But so many things do seem attractive, and I do have that feeling, and it's wonderful. I mean, I think it's very compelling. It also shows that how many unmet needs still exist, how some
Mm.
of the newer technologies, including both sort of biology wise, engineering wise, sort of information technology, or quote unquote, now everything is called AI, even if it isn't.
Yeah.
All these technologies brought together are really unlocking the ability, insights into what's going on with patients so that we can better treat them.
Yeah. You mentioned the fundraising part, not to get fully into fundraising and that landscape yet, but since you've been consulting like you are now full time, do you find inevitably that the conversations they start commercial advice and market approach advice and market access and everything else, but then suddenly it's like, okay, oh, fundraising is really the problem. Let's be honest. Fundraising is, this is what I hear from other, you know, executive commercial consultants who are doing a similar thing, that it all started with this really nice, there's so many different things that you can support with, and now it's like I'm basically a full-time fractional fundraiser for companies because that is just the priority that everyone's trying to get over. Is that something you're witnessing, or do you feel like we're hopefully moving sort of past that?
No, I think that's absolutely right, but I don't view those as either ors. To me, there's a lot
Yeah.
of overlap between your commercial strategy, your corporate, how you're choosing to build your company, and your fundraising, and they are interlocked. For example, there's a company, well, maybe I guess I technically could be a consultant and on the board of it, um, where they have this interesting opportunity where they could potentially, similar to like Inflammatix, like build their own instrument cartridge-based platform, and that could take, we can call it 3 to 5 years and $100+ million of raise to get to their promised land, and
Mm-hmm.
that's a viable path. Or alternatively, they could potentially put their test onto quote unquote other people's platforms, and then suddenly potentially shave years and tens of millions of dollars to their market, although arguably have maybe lesser upside because you would now be sort of on someone else's platform. And that trade-off is a real one, and it has, it impacts fundraising, it impacts strategic planning, it impacts commercial strategy, it impacts sort of what their R&D team focuses on. So we are, literally, as we speak, as an example, kind of in the midst of that conversation. I would also say that with even companies where the path to market is more straightforward. One thing I'm seeing that's maybe different than before is companies have to much earlier have a commercial plan than maybe they thought of before. Investors want to see a path to getting a return on their investment within a much more shorter period of time. And for you to present that path credibly, you have to have a plan that is credible, and frankly, in some cases, really really challenging to provide a plan, to sort of launch a product and have it, get covered by insurance and be standard of care within the 5 year window that an investor requires. So you need to be really kind of creative and strategic as to how you can kind of build a plan that works both commercially and for that fundraising story, as well.
Anecdotally, I completely agree because I think we've been fortunate to be hosting events with investment bankers specific to the diagnostics industry and life science tools industry. And the big theme that we've heard this year is investors are much less interested in the science, purely focused on commercial, and want to know when you're going to launch the product. Do you have a chief commercial officer? If not, when are you going to get one? And what's your route to profitability? and they're sort of like driving investor conversations right now, much, as you say, much earlier than they previously would. And science is almost being skipped out of the conversation, not obviously not entirely, but quite a lot.
Yeah, I think there's an assumption. So it used to be maybe that you know, that until you got to your Series C, you were focused for, maybe your seed in A was science, your B was clinical study, and then your C was C for commercialization, right? That was kind of the a typical pathway. Now the assumption is that all the science and much of the clinical evidence is done for your before your A or for your A. Once you're at your A raise, you have a clear path to regulatory clearance, whatever that is, whether it's FDA or CLIA in the US, or IVDR or MHRA in the UK. Yeah, there's sort of an assumption that you're going to have to do more earlier, which forces, going back to the kind of the role of a founder, is you need to be more creative and find other pots of money early on than traditional venture capital, because they're waiting for that sort of cash on cash return. In some ways, venture capital is acting a little bit more like traditional private equity in
Yeah.
that way. And you're seeing, sort of, governments, patient organizations, high net worth individuals, family offices, smaller angel checks, strategic partners. Sometimes they're the ones funding some of the earlier work, and the VCs are sort of acting a little bit more just as sort of important financial partners, but less on the venture side, than and more just on the capital side than before.
Yeah, same thing we're hearing. We're hearing less institutional money below $10 million, and that means that people are having to find other ways to raise money, continue going back to the early investors that would typically be friends, family, angels, and any other route they can get money. But then normally they would transition to that institutional money. That's now being delayed till, you know, much further down the line. It's an
And
interesting dynamic.
you're probably seeing this too in terms of hiring. It used to be that you would want to start hiring, for any given role, especially a leadership role, call it a year before you really need it for that person to come in and plan and build a team and build a plan. Now you're almost seeing we literally can't afford that. We need to bring in sort of fractional resources, to do more with less, and just start executing and bring in those people who are, while they may have the capability to build a plan and build a team, but they're being asked to come in and actually execute more with less time. Now, I will say, AI, whether it's AI flavor of the month, whether it used to be ChatGPT, now it looks like more people are transitioning more to using Claude. It is an excellent thought partner for those of us who are maybe in strategic leadership roles, but are also being asked to execute. If you can't hire a team of three, sometimes, which you may need, sometimes Claude can sort of shave that, and maybe you could do more with less. It'll be interesting to see if this is sort of the wave of the future, or is just a blip of, for a period of time.
Yeah, that is an interesting one, isn't it? You're completely right, by the way. The fractional side of the industry is going from strength to strength, especially early on. I'm a fan of it, if I'm honest, because I think it gives both parties almost like a working interview period where they find out much more than previously. It was, does job description match resume? Now, and rightly so, it's much more, does culture match personality, because they're
Mm.
the things that long term are going to make a great team between the two parties, and that creates longevity and tenure. So I'm a big fan of it because it actually creates, even though it's more temporary in its design, it becomes actually more stable long term when that person flips into probably a full-time role later on as cash flow increases and so forth. I think that's here to stay. If I'm honest, I think people have seen the benefits of it. You can now have more people fractionally that bring more perspective and consensus. And if you have a founding team that are humble and know their limits, know what they shouldn't be trying to do and assume, and sort of, leave the ego at the door and go, actually, if we do this fractionally, we can bring in more experience, more perspective, better consensus, better decisions. I think that's here to stay. The other side is the obvious one. We're just seeing seed stage companies bring in much more commercial experience earlier to help guide that commercial strategy. It just feels like the whole industry is chasing commercial experience, and earlier than we've ever seen it before.
I think you're right. I couldn't agree more with what you said. And also the other reality, at least as it relates to commercial planning and strategy, until you kind of have line of sight of launching your product within the next, call it 6 months, and then obviously once you're on the market, there are aspects of the role which you can do a lot with less time,
Yep.
especially if you're leveraging vendors. For example, if you're executing like a voice of customer market research study, while that's going on, you could potentially focus on another client, or that company doesn't have to kind of continue just to pay your salary while your time isn't being used as productively. So I agree. I think it's a win-win. I agree that it's probably here to stay for the early stage companies.
Yeah. And so we should really talk about your Inflammatix experience, because it's the most recent. Obviously, co-founding the company, being there, almost 10 years. What was your role at the company? But also, how did you come to starting the company? Take us through that.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll just provide a little bit of context before Inflammatix, from the companies I was at before, where I think the joining theme is the concept of, can we launch a high value molecular diagnostic company? And when I say high value, it means, high clinical impact, high economic impact, high operational impact in terms of truly transformative. Personally, I'm not motivated by bringing on sort of a slightly better version of a product that's already out there and just, sort of having a successful commercial product. Nothing wrong with that. That is I would argue most products are like that, and that's sensible. What motivates me and what gets me excited every morning is when we're trying to kind of, really lift that big rock up the hill and push it over the hill. Truly transformative changes. So when I was sort of, not to answer your question, when I was sort of considering sort of new opportunities, when I was at Telomere Diagnostics, we had I would say, a mediocre study result that they were developing. I mean, a really beautiful technology where they were using Nobel Prize winning insights around telomeres. And the idea was there that, could you identify if a patient needed a bone marrow transplant? For at least Caucasians, not necessarily true for other races, but at least at the time for Caucasians, the question wasn't as much, can you find a match for a bone marrow transplant, but which of the many matches you have is optimized, would be best for that patient. And the thought was that leveraging sort of telomeres as sort of a signal for cellular health from a potential donor, could you identify a patient, a better match for the patient needing the bone marrow transplant? To make a long story short, the test ended up having, I would argue, a mediocre clinical performance. It was a small market. The company chose to pivot to instead, and with my guidance as well, that this wasn't a product worth launching, decided to bring a product more to the consumer audience. And that wasn't the type of thing that, like I said before, gets me out of bed. So I was looking for new opportunities. And that's when I met Tim Sweeney and Pravesh Khatri through my Stanford network. And they were going after one of the holy grails, which is a sepsis diagnostic. The field of sepsis, whether it's both on the diagnostic side, there have been huge failures. On the therapeutic side, there have been over 100 studies done, none of them successful. So it was a huge, huge challenge. And like I said before, like the bigger the challenge, the more excited I'm going to get about getting excited. I had seen some of the elegance of the bioinformatics work out of Pravesh's lab at Stanford and thought, well, if anyone's going to have a shot at developing a omics signature that can inform on the presence, type, and severity of infection, which is ultimately what you want for a sepsis diagnostic, this team is going to figure it out. And we had the computational biology brilliance from Pravesh. We had Tim's brilliance as a sepsis research and clinician, and they were missing sort of that person that has done sort of the commercialization pathway, especially the 0 to 1 period, which I've done multiple times from prior roles.
And so, what was the role that you played with Inflammatix throughout the journey?
Yeah, my role transitioned. I mean, early on, we were just 3 founders. Pravesh was still a professor at Stanford, but very involved with the company. So it was Tim and I, initially a small team. Eventually, we had sort of multiple phases. I mean, titles wise, I don't know if they really matter. I mean, I guess early on, my focus was quote unquote everything but the science. I was focused on G&A, corporate strategy, trying to figure out what our business model was, because we had these signatures. We thought at first that we would put these signatures onto other people's platforms. Some of the big players, the Roches, the Biomerus, the Luminex, Abbott's, companies like that. We thought that, oh, we will put our signatures on their platforms, and we will be a company that is in charge of developing other molecular signatures. Because one of the things that Pravesh had shown is he had shown sort of a incredible ability to really understand the immune system's response to anything. He had at the time over 100 studies in different areas. Not all of them made sense to build a product around, but many of them maybe could. So our idea is we would become an algorithm development shop and partner with strategic diagnostic companies. What we realized is that none of the physical platforms, these instrument cartridge-based systems that were on the market or even frankly in development from smaller companies, had the profile to have what I would call as quote unquote true product market fit. We needed a instrument that could deliver a fast enough result, or a platform that could deliver a fast enough result, could measure enough markers for the signatures we were building, and not only measure those markers in a quantitative way, not just qualitatively. For example, a COVID test, simplistically, is a qualitative test. Do you have it or not? Do you see the line or not? A lot of tests in infectious disease or in cancer, it's about is there presence or absence? What we were doing, we were more measuring the amount of expression levels of the immune system's response in patients suspected of infection, and just a lot of the existing technologies did not provide that. So when we realized that, we said, you know what? For us to truly develop a product that meets the market demands, we need to build our own platform. So we pivoted as a company from being an algorithm focused company to one that is now an IVD manufacturer. And unlike many of the other companies that I was at, which were LDTs, where you could deliver a test result in days or weeks, here we needed to deliver test results in minutes, because we were dealing with patients coming to the emergency department suspected of an acute infection and sepsis, where the doctor is going to need to make a decision within minutes. So that became kind of our new path forward. Once we decided that we were no longer a algorithm development company, but a manufacturer of products, for me personally, my role is quote unquote everything but the science switched a bit. We realized that we needed to bring in expertise in the company on the manufacturing and operations side, because we were now going to be building cartridges and instruments. And at that point, I we brought on sort of a kind of more traditional kind of manufacturing COO types, and that type of function, and I moved more to sort of strategic planning, business development, and early commercial planning at that point.
And when did you guys launch that product?
So at that point, we weren't that decision was just, oh, we've decided to build a product. Then I mean, to be honest, we struggled a little bit to get that product to work. Learned a lot about the realities of outsourcing parts of product development and building an organization that could build a product successfully. But to answer your question, we were we had internal data that we had a product that would work and likely get through FDA clearance in mid 2024, which is when we submitted to the agency, and then the FDA, after receiving breakthrough designation in 2023, which helped expedite things a bit,
Yeah.
we were able to launch the Tri-Verity test in January of 2025.
Was it at launch that you personally felt that that was a good time to sort of go, okay, I think I want to go do other things now? Is that something that sort of went hand in hand, or was it just coincidental?
I wouldn't say it was coincidence. So maybe about 6 months before launch, like once we submitted our application to the FDA, we knew we had a very strong application that it would likely get cleared. We wanted to bring on sort of the right commercial leader for, I'll call it, early sales. We were very focused on identifying that. Now, my background has been, well, I've done some selling, quote unquote. My background, sort of, I started really kind of as a product management and building products that fit customer needs and made sense
Yeah.
for as a business. Product management, marketing, developed expertise in reimbursement, have done some selling, but we thought that it was imperative for the company, especially as we discussed at the beginning of the conversation, how investors' mindset was all about like commercialization and sales. We knew that kind of early sales success would be critical, and this product that we were bringing to market was pretty different. It wasn't just a slightly better version of that existed. So we
Yeah.
wanted to bring in a transformative commercial leader who was sort of maybe kind of sales driven. And at that point, I agreed with that approach and decided myself to focus more on strategic planning, business development, still help on reimbursement because that's an area of expertise that I have, and bring in someone to lead sales and marketing. Now, my transition out wasn't until we sort of did everything we needed to do from a reimbursement standpoint to get a CPT code, to get a price that we would be comfortable with, to get the initial clinical utility evidence study designed and implemented. Once those, I'll say, pillars were in place, then I felt comfortable that it was time for me to consider other things.
It just becomes such a different business at that stage, doesn't it? It's very natural that that things have to change, and I think actually in nothing to do with informatics, but across the industry, that change from research and development up until FDA approval, and then suddenly FDA approval into a sales revenue generating engine. I think it used to be a bit more forgiving for R&D folks, certainly, where there was still potentially work to do to improve and tweak and hopefully innovate. But actually, that sort of has become quite a bit of a cliff now for R&D folks, where it's like, oh, this company is about to flip the other side completely, and we see that a lot now. It's a really sharp turn. One of the things, obviously, you've been involved in a lot of launches throughout your career. It'd be great to sort of dig into where you think of sort of more objectively, sort of why some launches are successful and why, some of the lessons that you've learned through not failures, but some of the lessons you learned through being involved in so many launches.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. First, I agree with what you said before about companies sort of switching from R&D to commercial. I think one of the reasons for that is it is when investor dollars are wanting to make sure that companies, once you have a commercial product that's on the market, that it is successful before the company starts investing many resources into its pipeline. In some ways, it used to be years ago, um, there was a more of a longer term, more forgiving mindset of, okay, well, R&D can now focus on product 2, 3, and 4 while we launch this first product. Now the reality is, okay, we launched this first product, let's make sure that it's successful, and then maybe a year or two after launch we can consider products 2, 3, and 4, which is a little different. So I think that's what's addressing that dynamic. So I agree 100%.
Yeah.
Now, to answer your question, yes, I've done many launches. Some are big, some were smaller, product additions, new markets. I've had some unsuccessful launches as well. I think the keys to the successful ones and arguably the lessons of the unsuccessful ones, to kind of boil them down. I think first is, it's a true statement. We've heard it a zillion times. Is sort of make sure your product is a painkiller, not a vitamin. It's really addressing an unmet need that is significant. It needs to be significant, not just clinically, but economically. You need to be able to demonstrate economic value for the solution that you're bringing to market. Why is that? The reason why that's important is if you can deliver economic value, depending on the reimbursement schema, and it can get arcane and weird, but depending on the schema, you have a better chance to be able to extract more value for your product and have a higher margin, which if you can show higher margins, you can probably raise more money to be successful. So you have to have so that's one. And it is important to understand the reimbursement reality very early. I think, one of the things that, Bonnie Anderson, who's founder of Veracyte and now at PinkTX, one of the things that kind of we talked about when I was at Veracyte early on is you start with how you're going to get paid and you work backwards, both in
Yeah.
terms of, all your plans in terms of clinical studies, product development, fundraising. It's all driven by that, because if you can't figure out a way to get paid, you're not going to get this test to patients that need it. So that's one lesson learned. The other lesson learned, which I learned the hard way at XDX and now CareDx at the time, and saw the opposite when I was at Veracyte, is the financial incentives of what's the impact of your product coming to market going to be on your customer. Is the doctor that would order your test, you know, favorably or unfavorably or neutrally impacted financially? Not so much that doctor, but that institution, that health system. As we started the conversation about founders and their passion, you think that if you're bringing this product to a healthcare market and it makes a difference on patients, that people on the other side are going to instantly see that benefit and going to implement that technology, because they're going to have that same passion because they're managing these patients. The reality is even if they would like to, they do so in a more measured approach, because they have to understand what is one, they have to make sure that the evidence is credible, and then two is they have to figure out operationally, can we actually fit this in, and potentially, at the detriment of our current economic reality. For example, in CareDx, the test was a beautiful test, assesses whether a patient was rejecting, who's had a heart transplant, was the test could inform as to whether their heart was being rejected by the immune system. Before the test, the doctor would do an endomyocardial biopsy, which was painful, expensive, arguably not even that accurate from a pathology diagnostic standpoint. A blood test seems like a no-brainer to be much better. But the reality is, one, these are precious patients. You want to make sure that the test worked, and two, that those biopsies brought revenue to these academic centers and those programs, which funded fellows to being on staff. And the transition for those programs to say, okay, well, now instead of us making, call it, $5,000 per biopsy, and bringing that into the program, that goes away, and this test, which when we launched it was at $3,000, is going to go to some company in California. That transition is challenging and a real one to deal with. If you have a product that doesn't have that financial disincentive, or in some cases you have financial incentives for a doctor to want to do something, then you can bake that into your plans a lot better. And then maybe the last lesson learned that I'll share is recognizing that that it's a marathon, not a sprint, and to be very measured in your launch planning process. And you don't need to have every customer come on at once. Bring your product out, have good evidence, build up a good team, train them well. If you can show steady growth in terms of sales and market adoption, you win as a company. And you're also ultimately doing a better job at building a product that's going to be successful for that majority of customers who are more exacting. Early customers, the traditional adoption curve. There's some early customers who are very tolerant of issues when you're delivering a product. That middle market isn't tolerant. So that early launch experience and what you learn from there can help you make the more operational tweaks on the product, so that when you hit the middle market, you can really scale effectively and get to that standard of care level, which is our ultimate goal.
That's great advice, Jonathan. I think that there's this assumption, naivety is a better word. There's a naivety with early stage founders that once they launch, that the goal is to get sort of land a couple of large system networks, right? And it's like, you have not earned the right to be providing for some huge system, and you should really be trying to pick off, like you say, something smaller, digestible, where feedback flows very freely. You can be dynamic and improve quickly, and then as your operations improve, you take that up the food chain. That's really good advice. I think every early stage founder would love to just go, yeah, we've landed this huge whale client. It's like, now you're going to fail, and that's not great long term.
And I think there is a happy medium, which could be the best of both worlds. It's most practices are part of systems, most hospitals are part of systems. So the way to maybe deal with commercialization in this new environment, where they are all big systems, there are fewer smaller practices, is if you know how systems bring in new technology, some of them are very willing to experiment with a couple quote unquote pilot sites and demonstrate success at 1, 2, or 3 sites. And if you're successful there, in a weird way, as a small company, you can now leverage the internal mechanisms of that large system to go from, you can go from 3 customers to 100, potentially much faster, without having to hire a bunch of sales reps that you used to hire before, because you're now leveraging the big system's internal sort of, kind of product deployment process, and you basically have an account manager managing that process that is internal to the system, as opposed to you're the one kind of quote unquote selling to that next customer. So in a weird way, I think you're going to see more companies have explosive growth. And going back to the Inflammatix question, this is the exact phenotype of commercial leader we were looking for, is someone who had that expertise in not just sort of early sales, but selling across a kind of these larger complex systems.
What's your outlook on the diagnostics market for the sort of rest of 2026? Where are we, what we see, and how are you expecting it to evolve?
I think the market is going to continue, I would say, slight improvement mode that we saw maybe in 25, but not drastic improvement mode. I think the idea that we discussed earlier, I think we spoke to it quite a bit around um, younger companies will have to do more with less. Investors are looking for closer to commercial stage opportunities. I think that will be kind of the reality for 2026. I do also think that the the technologies are very robust and have the ability to make a huge difference, whether it's AI or engineering or biological technologies. We will continue to see this interesting tension of limited funds investing into very attractive companies that can make a big difference.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for coming on and sharing your insights into what you're seeing and your background and the ability to launch products. It was great to hear, and we really appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed the conversation.